Jared, what do we hope for today? And particularly Matt. Matt, what's kind of been on your mind that you would really like to talk about today?
Hmm, good question. Um, there's always a lot on my mind.
Yeah,
And
I know that.
I mean, so this is like a reboot of the podcast series. I mean, maybe if Jared,
Yeah.
you can share a little bit about what you're imagining. I can try to fill in some ideas.
Yeah, sounds good. So, yep, we're rebooting the Conversations in Process podcast as this part's totally up in the air. I mean, it's currently a joint venture of the Cobb Institute and the Center for Process Studies, but the Cobb Institute is very much being integrated as a aspect or part of the Center for Process Studies right now. So in terms of the specific language and sponsorship stuff, question mark. But I intend it to be a little more conversational rather than kind of interview style that we had a little bit more in some of the previous seasons of the show. And as kind of a venue to do a little bit more kind of exploration of new territory or kind of the edges of some of the process discourses, as well as kind of pursue some new conversational partners. I mean, there's a ton of folks certainly in this liminal, metamodern, blah 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 scene that are involved in some very resonant discourses. I'm very connected with those folks, but the cross fertilization with the process people is really just kind of in its infancy there, and certainly there's plenty of other similar
Mhm.
types of niches I could say the same about. So yeah, that's kind of the idea. But for these first couple episodes that we're going to be producing, rather than kind of jumping in kind of on the deep end of some of that novelty, we wanted to, yeah, have some of the more familiar faces in our community, and yeah, just kind of set a vibe for the show. So
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, I mean, one idea would be to talk a little bit about the Whitehead Centennial, um, and sort of the uh, state of the process union, or yeah, 100 years after Whitehead gets to the US, and 52 years of CPS.
mhm.
John Cobb's about to have his 100th birthday. Um, a lot of milestones and commemoration of the past. And yeah, I don't know if it could be fun to reflect on what happened at Harvard, and what the future might hold for process thought.
Yeah, yeah, I'd certainly be down to touch on that. I think in a previous email you said something about religion and like new forms of spirituality and traditional stuff, and kind of parsing that
Mhm.
from
Yeah.
more process perspectives. I'd very much be interested to get into that as well. Maybe we can find a bridge to meld those two topics together.
Yeah, I'd love to talk about that too. Um,
What are just a word or two, Matt, about what's been at the forefront of your own energy and consciousness these days, um,
mhm.
that you might like to get some feedback on?
Well, I'm teaching um, a course on consciousness this semester.
Hmm.
It's called Process Approaches to Consciousness, and
Hmm.
so I've been engaging a lot with the cutting edge in cognitive science and consciousness studies, philosophy of mind, and trying to find ways to well, I think I have found the ways that Whitehead is relevant, but I'm trying to find ways to
Hmm.
communicate about that to convince others um, of the clarification that his sort of process orientation to these questions can bring. Um, and so, you know, there's been a lot of popular books and content coming out. People like John Vervaeke and Philip Goff, and actually Goff, Vervaeke, and Anil Zeth, who's a a neuroscientist. They just had a
Yeah, I
dialogue.
just saw that one. I haven't listened yet, but it looks promising.
Yeah, I listened to it too. John Vervaeke mentions Whitehead uh, in a helpful way. Um, and so, yeah, I mean, there's all of these newfangled approaches in neuroscience that are based on what are called predictive processing approaches, and
Mhm.
it's all still in that paradigm that's imagining consciousness and human cognition as some kind of computation.
Mhm.
Um, and it's slightly less reductionistic than the earlier forms of computationalism, as it's called, but still, the human being and all animals are basically being imagined as sophisticated steam engines,
Mhm.
um, with this sort of patina of, you know, thinking about emergence and um, isn't it amazing what the brain does? And, and there's even a kind of, I could call like a mystical materialism. A lot of these scientists who think of the brain as a kind of statistical, it's like a divination engine, and we perceive what they call a controlled hallucination. That is our reality. We don't actually
Mhm.
know what the world is out there. A lot of these scientists give a very spiritual
Mhm.
spin to that. And so it's not disenchanting and doesn't lead to a kind of dreary nihilism for them. It leads to this embrace of a kind of mystery. But at the same time, I wonder if that's translatable into the popular culture. Um, when people hear that you and your reality, your world is just a hallucination, I don't know that most people would be led to a kind of mystical embrace of uh,
Right.
the groundless, uh, mystery of it all. So, um, definitely have a lot of thoughts about that, but that might be jumping in the deep end too quickly. I don't know.
I
Yeah,
think
we'll
there's
see if we can weave it. I mean, I like these topics certainly. Yeah.
I think that would be very interesting. So, I mean, right now we've got consciousness, and I'd be very interested in knowing what you think Whitehead adds to that discussion. And then we've got kind of the future of religion, spirituality. What does that look like? What does that mean?
Mhm.
Um, in a global context,
Yeah.
in light of the existing wisdom traditions,
Mhm.
um, are they to be surpassed? Can they be a part of the leading edge? Which ones? How? All those subjects. And then the future of the process movement.
Mhm.
Um, those there's plenty to talk about there. How, how about you getting us started with the future of the process movement? Matt, tell us what it is.
Mm.
What do you think?
You could share some ideas about that. Um, yeah, it's definitely global. It seems
Well, go for it. What are your impressions and thoughts?
mm. um well, I mean, did you get a chance to listen to the final panel at
I
Harvard?
listened to just part of it,
Yeah.
but tell me about it and where did it leave you?
Um, well, I think Catherine Keller was more optimistic about the ways that Whitehead's ideas are being picked up in academia by people like William Connolly and Jane Bennett, and even those who don't necessarily cite Whitehead are still carrying forward the process approach. And she was okay with Whitehead not getting credit for everything,
Mhm.
but just getting the ideas out there. But then there was Randall Oxier, Randy, who seemed more pessimistic and said some things that I found a little odd. Like he encourages his students not to write, his doctoral students not to write on Whitehead because he doesn't think they'll be able to get a job.
Mhm.
Um, and I found that, yeah, bizarre. Like,
Mhm.
I don't know that there are no jobs anyway, first of all. But uh, I think that things have shifted enough that an alternative sort of view that would come out of Whitehead's work might be more interesting to a hiring committee if someone wrote a dissertation on that than, you know, another study of Kant or whatever. Um, and and then, of course, everything going on in China, I think, is very interesting, and the relationship between Cobb Institute and CPS and the Chinese process scholars, I think, is one of the few signs of like a diplomatic alternative to the clash of civilizations that's otherwise occurring, and the saber rattling and military buildup and all of that stuff. I think I don't know how many other sort of friendly cross-cultural initiatives there are between Americans and Chinese, particularly outside the business sector, just in academia. I mean, I'm sure there's lots of stuff in tech, but even that, there's so much suspicion now because of spying and stealing technology and whatnot. Like, I just wonder, not to be too self-important, but how important is this? Are these threads that are being woven in this sort of diplomatic bridge between process scholars in the US and Europe and in China? I think it might be more important than we realize, if we're to avoid the worst case scenario in the coming decades.
Yeah.
So I see,
One of the things that really interests me about the process China connection is the way that the Whitehead philosophy discourses seem much more continuous and kind of harmonious with some of the existing traditional Chinese religious, spiritual, and philosophical traditions. Not that there isn't kind of important contrasts in the process philosophical material, and that's also part of the reason that this is exciting to our Chinese friends who are involved in this. But when I compare, say, the sense I get with like Christian process theology, it's often presented as this kind of very kind of novel take vis-a-vis like classical substance metaphysical based theologies, versus when I hear our Chinese friends talking about things, they're constantly drawing parallels with material from Taoism, Confucianism too, even, and other aspects of Chinese tradition. So I do wonder if they're also modeling a certain way that process perspectives can be more linked up with traditional material. And certainly there's a lot of interest nowadays, certainly in the West, but I presume in China as well, is re-engaging some of these ancient venerable traditions.
yeah, that's very interesting. It'd be good to dig into that compatibility that seems to be present between Whitehead and classical Chinese philosophies and religions. I think those two categories don't neither quite fits what Taoism and Confucianism are. It's kind of a philosophical religion or religious philosophy. I don't know, but there's also the question of the political implications of process thought. And there was a talk on Marxism and Whitehead by one of the Chinese scholars, which I found quite interesting. Whitehead seems to have been for his time, a kind of progressive liberal, supporter of labor and women's rights, but definitely more. Yeah, it seems to me he would have been, if you're around today, a kind of progressive liberal, not a Marxist. And so what's going on there? Is there an incompatibility between process thought and any particular political philosophy, or is it open enough that we can see ways in which it can be fruitful for various political ideologies and theories of political economy? I think that would be an interesting, in terms of the future. How does this, what would a process-inspired ecological civilization look like at the level of political economy? You've got the whole organic Marxism approach, but maybe there are other approaches too. Fun to think through that. Mhm.
I led workshops introducing Whitehead um, in China. I must have led 8 or 9 of them. And I wrote my little book, What is Process Thought, really for a Chinese audience. And if you ever look at that book, it doesn't talk about God all that much. It's introducing process thought without thematizing God as kind of the dominant interest.
Mhm.
But that was for a reason. It was because in the Chinese context, too much mention of God um, was more harmful than helpful if you really wanted process thought to take hold.
Yeah.
Uh, yes, there's continuity with Taoism. Yes, there's continuity with Confucianism. Yes, there's continuity with Chinese Buddhism. And for that matter, the classical Chinese arts and the healing traditions. All of those kind of fall within the tradition for them. But they want to my experience is they really did want to reclaim those uh, in the context of modernity, overwhelming modernity.
Mm.
And that was what was attractive about Whitehead and the process tradition. It really offered a bridge. Um, but the question of theistic religion was not easy to discuss at all. Whereas in the Western context, so many process people turn to process because Whitehead offers what they consider an alternative understanding of God that's plausible and relatively inspiring. But another question that emerged for me, and I want to throw this back to you all, is I found that the scholars wanted to talk Whitehead and including the metaphysics. So Fubin Yang's talk at the Harvard conference, it really has been an engagement with Whitehead's metaphysics and Marxism
Mhm.
uh, for quite some time. But I found that others that I was working with were not as enamored of metaphysics as they were of practical applications of Whiteheadian thinking
Mm.
to education, to urban-rural relationships, to agriculture, to psychology, um, questions of personal wellness and the like. And also, interesting enough, the theme of relationality was not quite as important to them. As one put it to me, we've got enough relationality.
Yeah.
We know about felt connections with other people. What we like about Whitehead is it offers space for a kind of creative individual thinking.
Yeah.
Uh,
So interesting.
and so I was left with a couple of questions. One is, how important is Whitehead's metaphysics to the future of the process movement? I mean, are they so closely tied that um, there's not much to say. Yes, the metaphysics and the future of the movement are essential. And then a related question is, if we think of process in terms of the future of religion, um, what about the non-theistic traditions?
Mhm.
What about Taoism? What about Chinese Buddhism? And what about the attenuated theism of Confucian traditions? So back to you guys. Any thoughts on any of that?
Um, hmm.
How closely tied is Whitehead's metaphysics to the future of the process tradition in your
Yeah.
mind, Matt?
Well, I mean, I think metaphysics is very important because it's always there in the background, but to what extent most people need or care to dig into that type of conversation and that level of abstraction is, you know, what Whitehead says, it takes a rather unusual mind to undertake an analysis of the obvious,
Mhm.
which is what he thinks metaphysics is about. Um, and so, I mean, there'll always be a place for metaphysics in my mind, and
Mm.
maybe in among folks like us who are interested in such discussions. But I find the applications to be um, so important. And actually, how do we really test the adequacy of a metaphysical scheme? It's through the applications. And how do we refine and revise our metaphysics? Well, through the application. And so there's an important feedback loop there. And I think the people who want to do the practical application and the people who want to reflect on the metaphysical presuppositions need each other. We really
Mhm.
need each other, um, because the metaphysics can inspire the practice, and the practice feeds back on the metaphysics. And um, ideally, we wouldn't have two different kinds of people who are doing each of these. You know, we'd
Mhm.
be able to each internalize it, but inevitably, some of us are more metaphysically inclined, and others are more practice inclined. Um, but both are absolutely essential. And you know, Whitehead's always pointing out the ways in which the metaphysicians and the modern philosophers in the modern period always appeal to practice to get themselves out of some metaphysical contradiction or
Mhm.
lack of in their system, some contradiction in their system. And he would rather have more coherence there between what the system, what the metaphysics describes and allows, and what
Mhm.
we presuppose in practice, you know. And so that pragmatic orientation in Whitehead's thought is um, one of the major gifts, I think. Um,
Are there areas of the pragmatics? Sorry, Jared, you go first. Yeah.
Yeah, one long-standing opinion I've had here is that philosophical reflection, fellowship, metaphysical speculation, these themselves are practices in a large respect. It's kind of odd how much we kind of divorce the fact that these are actual activities that are interconnected with other activities and human social life and such. Every so often, I'll see someone post some YouTube dialogue or promote a conference or something, and inevitably in the replies is someone saying like, "When are these gosh darn academics actually going to do
Mhm.
something?" I find it so odd because it's not a standard we hold almost any other niche or kind of activity to. Like no one is saying this to artists typically. No one's saying this to skateboarders. Like, oh, when are they gonna get off their boards and like fix the world's problems? And we're totally content to realize that the kind of self-enjoyment and community building and kind of intensity of life that these sorts of activities provide are sufficient justification for their continued existence. But it's actually funny because it feels like a subtle way that the kind of intellectual mode is being privileged or taken as exceptional in some way, that it needs to not only kind of be self-sufficiently rational and these sorts of things, but needs to solve all the world's issues in order to
Mhm.
be
Mhm.
justified. Because I guess that's what the expectation for philosophical reflection is. But yeah. Anyway, a little bit of a tangent, but it's something I end up thinking about a decent bit.
I think one thing I've wondered is what do we really mean by practice?
Mhm.
And the word can suggest a willful application of ideas. You know, for some people, that's what it means. It means you've got the ideas first, and then you apply them in a willful way in the real world. So that's a willful application of ideas. But I wonder if that's not something of an impoverished view of practice, um, building into a dichotomy at the outset
Right.
between ideas which come first, and then something called application, which comes second. I doubt that life is like that.
Mm-mm.
So maybe Whitehead offers a way of critiquing that way of thinking about practice, actually. And with lures for feelings such as the notion of the physical pole and the mental pole always occur together. And there's always a bodily dimension to experience, including thinking, including thinking. And the choice of one word, prehension, to name both physicality and mentality, conceptual prehensions and physical prehensions, one word, prehension. So maybe those offer food for a critique of insulated, shallow understandings of practice, actually.
Mm.
Maybe.
I think that's very well said. And Whitehead doesn't. I think that's all there in the letter of Whitehead's work, I think. But um, implicit, I think, is a sense that theory is practice already, like you were saying, also, Jared. That when we're engaged in the construction of a speculative scheme of these categories that Whitehead elaborates, he starts process and reality with the list of categories, but it's very clear that actually the order of presentation of process and reality is not the order at which he arrived at these ideas. He's arriving at these ideas by looking at all the special sciences, the experiments, by looking at religious experience, psychology, artistic experience, and then trying to generalize from all of those areas of application and practice to the metaphysics. And so, if anything, it's the reverse. The practice comes first, the theory comes second. But theory is it's participatory, and the way that we think and the new concepts that we create to think with do alter our perception, alter what we imagine to be possible as a result of the action that we might take. And so thinking is already an activity, and it's already transforming the world. But also, I won't say that I don't appreciate the prodding from activists, just to keep our feet on the ground and, remind us that in addition to our wonderful, fun philosophy conferences where we talk about ideas, there's also ways in which the process movement can get its hands dirty in the soil, feeding people, whatever, that this isn't just an intellectual community. Intellect is great and dialogue and ideas are great, but we're also trying to be engaged, to really take the ecological crisis seriously, to take the ideas seriously, such that our very sense of identity is bound up, not in an ideological way, but in the sense that if reality is composed of relational processes, then that means something for how we interact with each other. It means something for the sort of ethical motivations that guide us interpersonally and institutionally, and that we're always trying to maintain that coherence between our sense of what is true and what is good, and how these ideas show up in our everyday lives. Because I found, there are certain habits, maybe less than ideal behavioral habits that I can fall into, and then sometimes it's my understanding of a process relational ontology that clues me into, oh, that's not in alignment. I need to disturb this habit, this behavioral habit, to come more into alignment with this ideal that so that the intellectual insight can actually guide the change in behavior, because I feel the discomfort of a misalignment, you know? Um, and so, yeah, just different ways of acknowledging this feedback loop, and that while in the order of operations that leads us to devise a philosophy, I think we begin with practice and the theory comes out of that. But then the theory itself, once you have it, can continue to refine the practice as well.
I think, do you think it's accurate to say we begin with practice for Whitehead? Uh, would it also be true to say that we begin with experience?
Yeah.
And that includes feeling, and emotion, subjective forms. So I
Absolutely.
wonder if the word practice doesn't suggest kind of outer behavior,
Mm,
but the word experience suggests kind of it includes feeling, emotion, felt purposes. And Whitehead is appealing to those kinds of experiences all the time
mhm.
i- in Process and Reality. Um, Other books as well. So both the sciences, but also the phenomenology, you might say that.
Mm. Yeah, I mean, I think you're right to that switch to experience from practice, but there's something Whitehead says towards the end of the first chapter of Process and Reality, where he says that, philosophy finds it begins with our common sense interpretations of
Hmm.
how we experience the world. Um, and it begins with common sense, and then
Hmm.
builds out from
Hmm.
there.
Hmm.
It's like, not that philosophy is not responsible for our immediate interpretations of experience and our explanations for why we are motivated to behave in certain ways. Like, those are sort of the givens, the empirical given, and then philosophy reflects on that.
Right.
Because, Whitehead wants, sometimes science and philosophy, metaphysics are going to challenge common sense, but we can never, he doesn't want to push that so far, because there's this tendency in the sciences, especially to seek out heroic feats of explaining away
Mm.
common sense. And Whitehead says, look, we can challenge it, but at the end of the day, common sense is the final arbiter in a way, and because that's what guides civilization.
Hmm.
And he wants to avoid this intellectual tendency, and scientific tendency to constant. It's like so many reductionistic scientists just really are excited by the and by embarrassing common sense and saying, like, um we're so deluded and here's the truth, and it's
Yeah,
like
yeah.
so counterintuitive, isn't that great? And like Richard Feynman celebrating the fact that we can't understand
Mm.
quantum electrodynamics. It's like, but I want to understand it. Why can't I?
Hmm.
Why can't I square this with everyday experience? And I think Whitehead gives us a
Yeah.
way of acknowledging what's initially surprising about some of these scientific findings, but finding a way to tie it back, to weave it back into the texture of our experience.
Yeah.
Hmm.
Jared,
Yeah.
where does this leave you?
Yeah, I taking it back to the question that you raised earlier, like how much do we want to foreground Whitehead in particular? And so far, this has been a pretty Whitehead
Yeah, it has.
metaphysical conversation. I'm feeling more and more like a big tent kind of approach to the process community, where Whitehead is one central voice in the full richness of the kind of philosophical lineage he inaugurated and that we've been continuing. But one of the earlier process related books I read was this text, Shadowing the Anthropocene by Adrian Ivakiv. And there's a little bit of Whitehead in there. There's a lot of Peirce. And he specifically had like a list of, oh, here's some process thinkers. And his list was quite long. It certainly included Whitehead, Peirce, Bergson, some friends of ours in the kind of CPS lineage as well. But it included Nagarjuna in the Buddhist tradition and more contemporary Buddhist thinkers like Nishitani.
Mhm.
I think there were some Chinese
Mhm.
voices in that list as well, and I think he included some Islamic thinkers too, and likewise, I think there was some Neoplatonic Christian philosophers, and that's really kind of how I like to view the process, intellectual and spiritual lineage, as much broader than just Whitehead. But Whitehead perhaps provides some access to this whole idea of like a process-oriented philosophy that we can then backread any number of these thinkers to and create something that's really cosmopolitan, something that has deep historical precedents. Heraclitus, certainly someone like McGilchrist references this ancient Greek thinker as a central process philosopher who he would certainly place above Whitehead and his own influences there. So yeah, I'm liking taking this direction, and certainly then that hopefully gives all the more opportunity for connection and different doors of entry and different ways to weave some of the practice, some of the more concrete hands in the dirt kind of projects that all sorts of folks in our community are very interested in.
Hmm. Yeah, I'm pretty self-conscious, increasingly self-conscious about this label Whiteheadian philosopher. I think Whitehead would hate the idea of
I
there
think he
being
would. Yeah.
Whiteheadian philosophers. Um, but it's a hard label to shake, and it's not inaccurate. I mean, for myself, but I also feel a little bit, and increasingly so, suffocated by that. So,
Mhm.
but I have to make a special effort uh, to branch out. You know, I've been studying some Peirce, who's both, I mean, such a unique mind and very convergent with, Whitehead's major insights. Just a totally different way of arriving at them. Um, and so that's been fun. Um, but I think this shift to it being less about a particular, dead guy, and more about all of the dead guys across all the continents, and also how this work is being creatively carried forward, by people who might not be dropping Whitehead's name left and right, but who nonetheless share the same spirit of adventure and of sort of relational becoming, um, and even just when we shift to the ideas, like it can get somewhat tedious, I know, especially for non-academics, when me and Philip Goff are on Twitter arguing about substance versus process as concepts, and it's not, at the end of the day, it's not so much about the words that you choose to use, but how you're deploying them, and maybe substance doesn't have to be the enemy if we're understanding it in a more dynamic and relational way. Lots of substance ontologists are redefining it so that the difference between process and substance starts to seem less um, like a fork in the road, and more like a subtle matter of a few, you know, interpretive maneuvers that we can actually seek to arrive at some consensus around, instead of putting drawing lines in the sand and choosing our sides. Um, so I think, yeah, being more ecumenical and um, more willing to recognize the family of process thinkers and actors and creators, rather than just having it be about Whitehead. And I'm glad that, like, CPS has that name and not like the Center for Whitehead Studies or something, because it really sets up the future of this movement to be broader than that, broader than just Western philosophy, and broader certainly than just Whitehead's philosophy.
Yeah, I'm definitely interested in opportunities, possibilities to reconcile, synthesize, process, and substance thinking. I don't think these things always need to be in a dichotomy or an opposition or a kind of winner take all sort of mutually exclusive, rivalrous
Yeah.
relationship. And
As
here's,
long as it's process relational, you can call it substance if you want.
yeah, totally. Yeah, and this is certainly an area where it's like all the better that we can be, yeah, very cosmopolitan and ecumenical. I think of one of the major medieval Islamic philosophers, Mullah Sadra, the total shift in Islamic philosophy he inaugurated and moved away from sort of an essence first type of metaphysics to an existence first type metaphysics. And I mean, he's a substance thinker in some ways. He has a kind of deep Aristotelian lineage, but his kind of one of his main doctrines is substantial motion. So
Mhm.
certainly a process thinker and someone who kind of bringing in the conversation can definitely be an avenue to see ways we can parse the process substance discourse in some new ways. So
I, I've been helped a lot by Roland Faber, and I think he's one of the most brilliant process thinkers we have. And have you seen his book, The Mind of Whitehead? It's 600 some odd pages.
Right over there.
If you've read it cover to cover, Matt, you're a
I have not. I have
you're a
not. I
grand
dip
soul.
in.
But I'm reading it. But Faber speaks of Whitehead um, not as a box into
Hmm.
which everything must be fitted, but rather as a wildfire,
Hmm.
emanating sparks that ignite others to think creatively in their own way.
Hmm.
And I think early on, when people are enamored of Whitehead, they tend to think of Whitehead as a systemic box
Hmm.
um,
Yeah.
that explains everything. And it's so remarkably intricate that if you really understand the system, um, everything can be understood in terms of it. And Whitehead lends himself to that in Process and Reality. Uh, but Faber says that Whitehead has never interested him.
Hmm.
What has interested Faber is the wildfire Whitehead. And Faber turns to all kinds of works of Whitehead's modes of thought and adventures of ideas and science in the modern world and the lecture on immortality. All of that is fair game for Faber. He knows process and reality quite well, but he doesn't focus on it at the expense of the others. But if we take the notion of a wildfire that gives rise to sparks, and we think of the process movement as consisting of people who take some of those sparks and are on fire with them and take them further. And we think of a big tent, and I don't want our tent to be on fire, but if we think of a big tent like the people that Jared's mentioning, I want to raise the question, what are the common sparks? Really now, what are they? Um, is it that everything's interconnected? Is it that everything is fluid? Is it that all living beings have intrinsic value?
Hmm.
What are the shared sparks of the process movement that the Islamic thinkers and Heraclitus and Nishitani and Peirce share? That's really a question. What are the
Hmm.
shared sparks?
Yeah. I love that framing, and it makes me think of the Stanford Encyclopedia entry on process philosophy. I don't know if either
Mhm.
of you have read that. Joanna Seipt is the author.
Mm-hmm.
Hope I'm pronouncing her last name right. And she starts out by saying that process philosophy, obviously, in the 20th century, Whitehead's a big figure there, but that it's broader than that, and that it's more of a metaphilosophical movement,
Ah, nice.
in the sense that it really reframes the whole motivation underlying philosophy and metaphysics. And so it's like it's a different attitude. There's a unique
Uh-huh.
attitude here that's open and relational, but that's looking at philosophy not just as the pursuit of clear and distinct certainty
Mhm.
and final explanations for everything. But yeah, kindling the sparks that you're talking about, all of
Mhm.
those things, interconnectivity, relationality, um, an
What
emphasis
about
on
value, Matt? Would you add value there?
value. Oh, for
I mean,
sure.
I'm really, yeah.
Everything has value for itself,
Hmm.
for others, and for the whole,
Hmm.
right?
Hmm.
I think that has obvious application socially and ecologically,
Hmm.
I think quite directly. Yeah. Jared, you wanted to chime in?
Yeah, I don't think there's some list of necessary and sufficient conditions to be some historical figure that fits into the, say, lineage of process thought. I think this needs to be a kind of active project of reading and interpreting on our own parts. And I think this big tent is as much constructed as it is kind of these sparks that are out
Hmm.
there. Certainly, there are lures of feeling in all these figures we've mentioned that make them seem rich and brimming with potential to be kind of brought into this community. But I think there's sort of active work that needs to be done to yeah, allow this vibe, this meta philosophy to have broader reaches and expressions that perhaps weren't uncovered previously.
I'd like
Mm,
to add beauty
mm.
to our
Aesthetic.
list of what goes into the vibe or the attitude or the meta philosophy. Um, a recognition of beauty as an attractant in human life, equal to truth and goodness,
Yeah, absolutely.
equal to. And I think the vibes include that sensitivity, myriad kinds of beauty. And I think Islamic traditions, by the way, have a lot to offer this with their Neoplatonic influence, actually.
Mm, right. Yeah, beauty is an important value. I mean, I agree with Jared. There's not a list of attributes that one would need to check off in order to be welcomed into the process community, but because that would construe process thought as a kind of substance with its
Exactly.
essential properties, and
Yeah.
um, but I think it's like built into this meta philosophy is the sense that there's an inevitable life cycle, and what makes it what makes process thought metaphilosophical is that it recognizes the inherent life cycle of all philosophical schools of thought.
Mhm.
you know, um, which doesn't mean that it itself won't eventually be supplanted by some new, more encompassing sort of orientation, which is as yet impossible to name or characterize. But I think of those lines in part 5 of Process and Reality about the greatness in the lives of those who build up religious
Mhm.
systems,
Mhm. Mhm.
a greatness in action and idea and self. I'm not remembering this, but I'm reading this. A greatness in action and idea and in self-subordination embodied in instance after instance through centuries of growth. And there is greatness in the rebels who destroy such systems. There are the titans who storm heaven armed with passionate sincerity. And he says it may be that the revolt is the mere assertion by youth of its right to its proper brilliance, that the final good of immediate to that final good of immediate joy. And like there's the aesthetic, there's the beautiful again that's driving all of this. And it's not a static beauty, it's a beauty that's ever enriched by each contribution, um, made by those who build up and those who tear down these great systems.
Mhm. Mhm.
Hmm, yeah.
Well, this is to suggest that the future of the process movement may partially depend on thinking of the movement as metaphilosophical, a movement of attitude, um,
Right.
and not a movement of a school of thought,
Right.
rigidly defined.
Yeah. Process and reality was not meant to be the new dictionary,
Yeah, good.
the new perfect dictionary that
That's right. Well, it sure is fun to learn the terms, though. Isn't that a joy?
yeah.
But then you think you've got the dictionary.
Mhm. Right.
Matt, when Jared and I were talking about getting to visit with you, Jared mentioned, and if I'm wrong about this, I don't think I'm wrong actually, um, that you had been thinking about how the process movement might help engage discussions politically
Hmm.
between right and left.
Hmm. Right.
And that's an on-the-ground subject.
Definitely.
Um, you want to turn it in that direction a little bit? Have you been thinking about that?
Sure. Um, was it in Adventures of Ideas, Whitehead says the pure conservative is fighting against the essence of the universe. So there's a little, sense that he's taken sides there, but at the same time, he'll say in not quite as pithy a way, but nonetheless speak to the importance of um, inheriting the, the traditions and values of the
Mhm.
past, and of not being so sure that introducing a radically, even revolutionary new
Mhm.
idea
Mhm.
into some social context, that so sure that it's going to improve things, especially if it's meant to, as the occurred in the French Revolution, to like wipe away everything before, as if all the inertia built up into the institutional forms present in our society today could just be um, the slate could be wiped clean and we can start fresh and build it up all just as if from a blank slate. I think Whitehead's he warns against that sort of unmoored um, extreme progressivism because of the way in which it actually unleashes a lot of chaos. And it's in a sense like sawing off the branch that you're perched on and not realizing that you're going to fall with it.
Mhm.
Um, and so both his sense of his reading of history as driven by ideas, and it's so, um, he clearly sees the importance of philosophy in entertaining ideas, which over the course of centuries can be gradually ingressed into the habits which shape society. But that he's also cautious. And, this is where I wonder about Marxism um, as the way in which, as if it's an easy application of Whitehead's philosophy to the political arena, political economic arena. I'm not sure, because that would imply a kind of um, revolution. And I
Mhm.
think Whitehead's not a revolutionary.
Mhm.
You could, use the metaphor, oh my gosh, what a revolutionary philosophy. But in the political
Mhm.
arena, I think he's much more cautious, and he would be worried that I think he would see liberalism as a major advance upon the political forms which came before it. I mean, even Marx sees, liberal capitalism as an improvement on feudalism, and imagine that history would take a certain course that inevitably led to communism, and that hasn't happened. But I think this fervor for a kind of revolutionary break with the past is something um, that process thought would both want to entertain and discuss and dialogue about, but revolutionary violence has not proven, it doesn't have a good track record
Mhm.
historically
Mhm.
in terms of what ends up replacing
Mhm.
the evils that the revolution sought um, uh, to destroy, because very often a new hierarchy emerges, and while we thought we were wiping away the old habits, they're still there because we can't escape them. We're made by them in some sense. And so just finding that right balance between the conservative and the progressive impulses, and recognizing that actually a healthy society needs to find a way of integrating both impulses, that we respect the past and we understand, as messed up as so much of the deep structure of our society is right now, it could be worse, and it's fragile, and it could be, to get to the place where we want to get in the future, we don't want to just throw out all the progress that we've made already. Because we might underestimate the extent to which there is a chaos seething underneath. And I'm not saying I would buy into the whole kind of traditional idea of a liberal society where there's a social contract, and we were in a state of nature as just individuals competing in a cutthroat way, and this social contract established order, and without that there'd be chaos. I don't think that's quite an accurate way of imagining where social order comes from, but nonetheless, I think there's an important caution.
There's some truth in that too. Yeah.
Mhm.
It's
Yeah.
it's,
Do you
it's
think
Hobbes. It's Hobbes.
Hobbes, yeah.
There's some wisdom in Hobbes.
Hmm.
Not all the wisdom, but some wisdom.
Right.
Sorry, Jared.
Yeah, this is an interesting line of discourse for sure. I feel like I've encountered some readings of process philosophy, which I don't personally find as compelling readings, but people who focus primarily on this idea of interconnectedness and harmony, that would take a process
Yeah.
perspective to always value connection, always value harmony. And from such a perspective, any kind of, say, violent resistance might be unjustified. So even as perhaps violent revolution might not be the kind of primary mode of political advancement that comes out of a process perspective. Do you think there can be a way that more forceful forms of opposition and struggle for life and rights can be honored from a process perspective?
Yeah. Whitehead wasn't a pacifist. He, I think, reluctantly supported World War One. Sent all of his kids were, in the war, and I think he and Evelyn were proud of that service, and lost one of his sons in the war, and his friend Bertrand Russell was in prison for his pacifism. And so I think it's not that Whitehead would say violence is not sometimes justified in defense of one's livelihood and one's people, um, and it's he's celebrating the rebels who destroy institutions and seek to upset the settled order of a society, and was very aware of the potential of civilizations to become decadent and the need for things to be stirred up. And so it's not just that harmony is always better. I mean, harmony can become boring if there's not adequate discord injected here and there to spur on more complex harmonizations. So yeah, we're seeking harmony, but not static harmony. We want to jazz it up. And so yeah, it's complicated, right? And I think Marxism is an important perspective to have at the table. I just think Whitehead's cautioning against that sense of self-certainty and revolutionary zealotry that I think blinds one to the shadow side of any particular political ideology, and like the value of, I mean, I have plenty of critiques of liberalism too, and we might already be in a post-liberal age and need to think creatively about what the future society might look like. But I think there's so many ways that democracy can be actualized, that aren't even necessarily liberal in the sense that it's the individual that is the final
Yeah.
arbiter of all value and truth. We can be more communal. And it's interesting, just to tie back to the earlier cultural difference, where the Chinese process scholars are, the relationality is like the water they swim in, and they're more
Right.
interested in the
But
individual freedom.
relations can be oppressive and they can be
Yep,
suffocating. And so
exactly.
to lift up relationality as kind of always good
Right.
is a problem.
Right.
Yeah, we
There's a
don't
balance
want
to be struck.
uniformity, certainly.
Right.
I mean, the other major kind of value in Whitehead's scheme of beauty, I think, is not just harmony, but intensity.
Yeah.
And so
Right.
that
I,
can't be sacrificed for harmony in
Jared, I
Whitehead's.
want to make a little technical point here. In process and reality, intensity is the aim
Mhm.
of every moment of experience. It's not harmony. I mean, harmonious intensity is a good thing, but the word he
Yeah.
uses is intensity.
Mhm.
Um, he shifts in Adventures of Ideas to a little more of this emphasis on harmony. And I think that the rhetoric of process thinkers has sometimes neglected the fact that he did see intensity, and intensity is vitality.
Mhm. Yeah.
And vitality is not reducible to peaches and cream.
Right.
It has a vitality to it, a zest to it. And so sometimes fervent acts of disruption can be wonderfully intense,
Mhm.
invaluably intense. I can't make my peace, however, with a shift over into certain kinds of violence. I, I can't go for that kind of intensity. Um, Others may be able to. I'm not a pacifist, but I don't think I'm a violent revolutionary either. Um,
Yeah.
there's a rhetoric in process thought sometimes as if we had an ecological civilization, all would be well. Um, utopia is just around the corner if we'll only learn to think in the right ways. But Whitehead had a real sensitivity to tragic beauty.
Mm.
It doesn't matter what state of affairs you're in. There's going to be loss. There's going to be decay.
Yeah.
Um, it's not all going to be messianically wonderful someday here on this planet. And that's a kind of conservative impulse too, to
Mhm.
recognize the illusion of utopian thinking.
So important. Um, yeah, I think that's the danger of um, the zealotry of the sort of revolutionary spirit, is that it imagines that the actual and the ideal could just
Yeah.
be fused, and Whitehead's
Yeah.
maintaining the tension between actual and ideal
I think
always, always,
always, always.
um, which is what gives rise to the intensity. I mean, tragic
Right.
beauty would be the more intense form.
Isn't that funny? Yeah.
And peace he defines as the zest for life. It's not
Mhm.
just this placid sort of quiet
Well,
retirement.
I need to challenge that just a little bit. He does speak of peace, though, as the relinquishment or the falling away of the sense of acquisition,
Mm, right.
and focused on the individual personality.
Mm,
So peace comes with a kind of widening of consciousness,
yes.
uh, that there's a dropping away of that acquisitive impulse. There's a zest there, but it's a different kind of zest, I think.
Self-forgetful
Yeah, yeah,
zest.
yeah, yeah. Self-forgetful zest. Now
Yeah.
that
Yeah. Just giving, in other words, giving oneself
Mhm.
moment by moment, living in the superject,
Right.
um, rather than in the subjective immediacy, as though you could hold on to that for a second.
Mhm,
It's always
mhm,
passing,
mhm,
right?
mhm.
But yeah, this longing for utopia is dangerous, is really dangerous. And I think it's, on the other hand, the opposite extreme would be that form of conservatism that would say, be blind to the struggle
Mhm.
of the homeless and the
Oh,
downtrodden and everything, as if, well, that's just the nature of things, and you get this sort of social Darwinism. So there's an extreme on either side here
right.
that we need to balance. We can always improve, but we can never be perfect.
Mhm,
Um,
mhm.
and I think this idea of the divine and Whitehead's whole treatment of evil and sense of that, yes, the kingdom of heaven is with us, but it's with us as our love for what could be, without the insistence that we can possess that
Yeah, yeah.
ideal, you know. But we're always striving to realize it ever more, without imagining we could finally get rid of the bad people and get the right people in power, and then it'll fix it all.
Well, you see that on all sides, don't you?
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. Hmm.
Jared, what does this leave us?
Well, we definitely covered a lot of territory here. I'd love to hit some of the topics we brainstormed that we didn't quite get to in terms of some of the consciousness and
Can
yeah,
we do so?
parsing.
Do we have time?
I'm not in any rush.
And you can
Certainly.
edit everything, so
Yeah, yeah, yeah. It's all me.
Hmm. Yeah, well, I mean, I could try to introduce that subject and tie it to, more of these real world applications, and the politics and economics. Because when we study consciousness, it's a unique subject of scientific and academic inquiry, because we're really turning the mirror back on ourselves,
mm,
and it's just as personal as it should be, at least just as personal a subject of inquiry as it is a scientific one, where, yeah, we're seeking some kind of universal account of what this phenomenon is, but we're also, as researchers, very much bound up in this mystery we call consciousness. And as Whitehead would say, as we think we live. So the ways in which we imagine, the concepts we develop to try to lasso this phenomenon, actually changes it. We are making ourselves as we um, and shaping our experience of ourselves as we develop language and research programs, and so that's both I think what makes it so exciting, but also it's kind of high stakes, because um, if you look at the history of science, the way that paradigms unfold, there are certain paths that are taken and others that are left untrodden. I mean, think about like the theory of gravity. Like, everyone's physics has gone with Einstein, could have gone with Whitehead's theory of gravity. Totally different implications um, for our cosmology. Maybe things will come back around eventually, but with consciousness, it's similarly the case that, depending on which of these research programs gains more institutional legitimacy and gets more of the funding, we're going to increasingly start to think of ourselves in terms of that paradigm. And I think what process thought can offer is, again, a metaphilosophical perspective on the way in which uh, consciousness is not just another natural phenomenon out there
mhm.
that we could objectify and build a model of, and thereby understand and explain. Um, we, I think, have to see it, consciousness and experience as such, as more like it's the very medium that makes our inquiries possible. It's not just another object to be inquired into. Um, and so there's a certain sacredness to all of science, in a way, because we're learning um, and pursuing the very truth of things. And as Whitehead would say, scientists are devoted to the truth with a certain kind of religious fervor. Um, but it's also sacred because particularly when we study consciousness, we're studying our own nature, and we're studying that the theater in which these great values, truth, beauty, and goodness, become most luminous to us. I mean, it's because we are conscious that we can apprehend and entertain these values. And so if consciousness is what affords us this orientation to pursue truth as such, then it's I think that attitude is a check on the typical scientific mentality, which would seek mastery and control over everything that it studies. But again, if the paradigm that wins out in consciousness studies is that which is seeking greater prediction and control, and so develops a model of what cognition is and consciousness is that maybe is highly predictive, maybe it does help in its application in our current political economy, help advertisers figure out how to better manipulate us on social media to buy their products, because to some degree, we are, there is a sense in which the brain and our behavior is a kind of sensory motor loop, and we have certain deep instinctual motivations, and it's easy for these things to be manipulated. And I don't think that's all that we are, but the model captures some of what we are. Clearly, I mean, it's why Facebook can shape elections. But I think if process thought and this whole family of approaches we've been discussing continues to have more of a say and continues to be involved in these conversations about the nature of consciousness, that we can avoid capture by one particular model and avoid the fallacy of misplaced concreteness, such that the model becomes identified with the full reality of what consciousness is and what it makes us capable of.
Right. Yeah, the predictive processing theory is very interesting. It's very compelling in many regards. But it is interesting how so often, these folks talk about hallucination as what's going on in our conscious experience, and that's certainly a very loaded term. I'm certainly there with them insofar as experience is creatively constructed in a particular subjective form. It's not just sort of raw, pre-existent data received in some passive way. But yeah, I definitely think the kind of Whiteheadian process scheme is really helpful here in that of course, that's kind of like a basic feature of reality. Of course, at different levels of complexity, but the amoeba is also creatively constructing an experience of itself that is it's not just pure reception. It has this sort of aspect of subjectivizing the pure data prehended. And so is the microbe also hallucinating? At what point, when this is kind of a basic feature of our ontology, does it feel kind of weird to talk about it as hallucinating, as if this is some kind of artificial or odd aspect of what's going on with not only living beings, but the kind of basic fabric of existence?
I wonder how this is related to Whitehead's idea that every moment of experience begins with a feeling of something, apprehension of something other. In the language of hallucination makes me think of all as projected. But I
Very
think
solipsistic,
Whitehead was pretty insistent that doesn't correspond to our lived experience. that our lived experience moment by moment begins with a feeling of something other than us. It can be our personal past, it can be our body, it can be our surrounding environment, it can be an ideal. But it's the prehension of otherness. And that's related, in my mind, in common parlance, to the notion of awareness. And so when I first think of consciousness, I think of conscious awareness, uh, and even more specifically of sense perception. So at this moment, I'm consciously perceiving the images of you on a screen. And I'm perceiving your voices. There's auditory reception as well as visual reception. I think of that as consciousness. And it, it could be all a hallucination. But if so, I want to thank the two of you for presenting such a fascinating hallucination. But I really find that just very doubtful. So it gets back to the question, all right, what do we really mean by consciousness? Does consciousness include awareness of otherness? Not simply creating something out of what you're aware of, but does it include the awareness? If so, it's non-objective, it's not a datum, it's not an object perceived, it's the perceiving of the object. It's noetic, not noematic. And that's a little, I think that's an insight, among other things, of the Zen tradition in the Kyoto school. Consciousness has a non-objective dimension that's always in lived experience. But Matt, I don't hear much of that attention to non-objective awareness of the other in the accounts that you're encountering yourself. It may be there. That's really a question for you. What is the status of non-objective awareness of the other?
Well, I think these predictive processing approaches in cognitive science are becoming increasingly the dominant paradigm.
Mm-hmm.
And they do tend to describe our consciousness, our perception as a hallucination,
Uh-huh.
as a sophisticated construct, and that what we really perceive are our expectations based on a world model that's running, and then we have a self model that's modeling our own modeling of the world. And so we don't have access to otherness. No, there's no prehensive
Yeah.
feeling of the other
Of
becoming
me,
part of
me
ourselves.
talking to you.
No.
Are you
I have a
talking to
model of
me?
you. I mean, the idea would be I have my J model running and my Jared model running, and I'm correcting the model when my sense data of you diverges from my predictions of how the model of you is supposed to behave. But that sense data, and here Whitehead's theory of perception and his criticism of the sensationalist doctrine, as he calls it, is super relevant because there's a too abstract an understanding of what sense data, what are the data actually? Is it true that what Whitehead quips once in Process and Reality is like a young man does not begin dancing with a cluster of colors, but no, and then proceed to conjure a dance partner. It's like, no, we perceive the other as a kind of agent directly through causal efficacy. We feel this directly. And then the sense data of, distinguishable colors and whatnot is a secondary elaboration on this primary mode of fluid interconnection and causal connection through feeling, and there's no equivalent to that, as far as I can tell, to causal efficacy or prehension, physical prehension in these predictive processing accounts. And the irony here is all of these theorists say we don't know the truth. We know what our model tells us and what's allowed us to survive well enough as a species, the deeper structure of the model, and then as individuals through our life experience, we build up the model. But what the truth is independent of us, we have no idea, except of course for this particular theory, which is obviously true. Like somehow we have scientific knowledge of this predictive processing theory, even though everything else is hallucinatory and constructed. So there's a little bit of you know, a lack of sort of it's a performative self-contradiction in a way.
Right.
You know, the very theory you're putting forward suggests that we should not take this theory or any theory seriously because we're constitutively blind to the nature of reality. I'm reminded of that line from Whitehead's Science in the Modern World, I think, where he says, some people express themselves as though bodies, brains, and sense organs were the only real things in an entirely imaginary world, right? And so it's like we forget with these predictive processing approaches that any neuroscientist's attempt to study the brain is just the brain in their world model. Like we never actually get the real brain, but the assumption is that the brain is what's constructing all of this. And so, yeah, when you really prod under the hood of these theories, I think it starts to break down.
Do you think that an adequate understanding of consciousness needs a distinction between mind and brain? Of the sort Whitehead had, I don't mean two substances of a different ontology, but I do mean that the perceiving subject is not precisely identical with the totality of neurons in the brain.
I think we have to make that distinction. I mean, you know, what Whitehead says at some point, like Descartes obviously says something that is true. And the question is, how do we interpret this distinction in a way that is still metaphysically coherent and doesn't require, you know, distinct substances? Yeah, I mean, there's a mental pole and a physical pole. And so instead of duality, we have polarity. And the mental pole is non-local.
Yeah, and I'm really talking here about the dominant occasion of experience.
Yes.
Which receives input from the neurons and initiates responses, but it's not a particular neuron among neurons.
No. I would see the brain, our physiology is something like the wake left behind the mind as an activity of, you know, responding to and ingressing real potentiality, responding to real potentiality in the past and ingressing sometimes when we're creative, pure potentiality, you know, as yet uningressed, as yet unactualized ideas or eternal objects. And so the mind, if you want, is the process of novelty production that's always ahead of what we tangibly feel and see, which is the physiology of our bodies and brains, which is more like the wake left behind that. It's real, but it's not what's doing the thinking and feeling and willing.
Yeah. And then you wonder about non-local connections too, because this mind that's ahead of its wake is somehow connected with that mind of with you. And so there does seem to be a mind-to-mind connection that I guess would have to be a non-local connection.
Yeah. Well, we're connected physically through space-time by virtue of physical prehensions, but we're also connected conceptually through the realm of eternal objects.
And also maybe hybrid prehensions.
And hybrid prehensions. Yeah. No, so Whitehead says somewhere that, you know, the closest we come to perceiving an actual entity as such is when we're in, you know, intimate dialogue with another human being. And a kind of mind meld can occur. You know, where we get closest using language or, you know, gesture and subtler forms of nonverbal communication. We get closer to the experience of actually apprehending the same propositions, which are not the same as sentences for Whitehead, but that we can actually feel in sympathy with one another, this structure of possibility. Language helps us coordinate that, but it's deeper than just the sentence form that we try to express propositions through. There, we can't quite capture a proposition in language, but we know when we know when we feel it. You know it when you feel it. Yeah. Hmm.
Well, Jared, may we turn to the future of religion?
Let's do it. Yeah.
Would you mind getting us started?
Sounds good. Yeah, we're in an interesting moment, religion, spirituality wise. I think there's definitely been a palpable shift since the kind of excitement around new atheism, a little over a decade ago now. And there's a lot of renewed interest in spirituality, traditional religion, a lot of energy there, even as demographically, this group of nuns, people with no strong religious or spiritual affiliation, is becoming more and more dominant. So, yeah, people are hungry, feeling homeless, spiritual and religion wise, but yeah, what can process perhaps do here? Can it speak to folks religious seeking, spiritual seeking? Can it revive aspects of existing traditions in ways that are more palatable to contemporary sensibilities? Can it offer critiques of our contemporary sensibilities that may be leading us in not the best directions culturally, socially? Yeah, it's yeah, I don't know. I'm very interested in process and traditionalism, how these might fit together, what relationship there might be here, because I mean, one of the kind of strong currents, other than this growth of nuns, is a growth in religious traditionalism,
Yeah.
especially amongst uh, converts to Catholicism, Eastern Orthodoxy in particular, in the Christian world. I certainly see it in my Muslim communities, very traditionally minded converts and people deepening their relationship with their own faith tradition, and people have been attracted to Buddhism and Hinduism, certainly in the West, since the kind of major importation of these things culturally in the 1960s, and uh, got an interesting first import in terms of how it was secularized in significant degrees, and now amongst folks looking at those Eastern Dharmic traditions, there's a kind of renewed interest in actually following a, say, Dzogchen lineage or a Rinzai Zen lineage, and rather than being, say, Stephen Batchelor type secular Buddhists. So,
Mhm.
yeah, that kind of sets the stage, I guess.
Hmm. Yeah, so I think it's been somewhat surprising to me to see this resurgence of not just, I mean, there's a resurgence of interest certainly, but like people are converting
Mm.
to traditional religious forms, um, whether it's Christianity or Islam or some of these Buddhist lineages, and getting kind of, it's almost like the spiritual but not religious thing has been um is starting to be surpassed in a way as like too shallow an engagement with. It's just like it's I feel like more people see it as a kind of spiritual consumerism, and now they're trying to get real and make a commitment to something that has history, that has roots, and that can provide a more what is perceived to be a sort of solid foundation for one's own identity, one's purpose, one's meaning in the world. And it's like um that individualistic choose your own adventure type of attitude that I think, for much of maybe the last couple decades was building, and there was a lot of energy around, seems to have, like, that wave maybe is beginning to crash, and this new thing is starting, which is on some level a positive sign, but on another level potentially reactionary. So how it shakes out is not yet clear, and that means we can still have an influence, as a process community, on helping to shape that discourse. I'm very interested in traditionalism as well. I've had some dialogues before he passed with Wolfgang Smith, who's he's Catholic and um, real strong advocate of the perennial philosophy and this traditionalist view of Platonism basically. And he's interesting because he draws a lot on Whitehead and appreciates Whitehead, but also totally rejects the sort of process theism and the whole evolutionary account of the cosmos. And I think he's a very brilliant guy, but in all respect to him, I think has a kind of caricatured view of evolution, or had.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah.
but I think what I struggle with in terms of the traditionalist approach to a kind of universalism and inclusivism that, all the religions are paths to the same peak or whatever, is that emphasis on universality actually, um, it I don't find a way of I can't fully jump on board because I don't see any way for me to include this other value that's important to me, which is the particularity of each of these lineages and traditions. And myself having gone on a journey from most of my teens as an atheist to then really identifying as a Buddhist, very modern Buddhist, westernized form of it, coming out of mostly like Alan Watts and DT Suzuki and those, the whole beat generation hippie appropriation of Eastern spirituality. And um, looking back, I can see how uprooted the form of Buddhism I was seemingly identifying with was from its true cultural roots. But and then in my late teens and early 20s, really having this series of mystical transformative experiences that brought me back to Christianity, which is, um, what I ran from initially because of how, in my family context, it was understood in a more less flexible way, let's say. And so what I've come to value about um, Christianity is this emphasis on this particular person, and also remembering that Jesus was not a Christian. um, and where is that? But at the same time, the power of the particularity of the core symbol and personality of Christianity, which is now so diverse in and of itself. But then also the problem of religious pluralism, which I take very, very seriously, is another tremendous value of mine. And so I think where process thought can help, though it doesn't solve any of this for us, is achieving a kind of deeply pluralistic understanding of the world religions and spiritual traditions that allows us to maintain a sense of the particularity and the irreducibility of each tradition, and a caution about rushing too quickly to kind of universality, and a form of inclusivism that actually requires erasing the particularity, right? So how do we maintain the diversity and maybe the deeper identity that's unspeakable, and we hold it with as a guiding heuristic to help us come into interreligious dialogue, but we don't insist upon saying anything too definite about what that universal core is. So yeah, I don't know. How does that all land for you, Jared?
Completely agree. Yeah, I would say the process account gives a much better resource for a pluralism that, yeah, isn't this uniformity amongst the traditions, that can identify and acknowledge the unique values that each of these spiritual lineages possess, even as there are certain commonalities that we can for sure point to as well. One topic, I think the traditionalist, in the sense of like the perennialist approach to religious pluralism, one thing I think they do really well is, with a caveat, is they do a good job delineating what kind of authentic spirituality or religiosity is. And I think that's an important question too in an era of say increasing religious fundamentalism and all sorts of idiosyncratic cults. These are certainly things that are popping up as well. And so some of the perennialist ideas about say these kinds of authentic revelation and authentic initiation in lineages that have some kind of connection to a divine ingression that then a community has reasonably faithfully kind of stewarded up to our contemporary times. I think that gives a kind of strong account for what might be a good spiritual path, a holistically healthy spiritual path to engage in. How do you think the process perspective can offer resources in that direction? Not only acknowledging a pluralism, but saying actually some of these things don't kind of fit our criteria for authentic or healthy spirituality or religiosity.
Yeah, I could dive into that, but I want to see if Jay has, do you have any thoughts
No,
on
go ahead, Matt, please.
Well, I mean, I think the distinction between creativity as the ultimate and God as a creature, the primordial creature, but nonetheless a creature of creativity, provides at least an opening for theistic and non-theistic religious and spiritual traditions to dialogue with each other. At the same time, often when I speak with more traditional or classical theists, the idea of God not being all powerful is like, well, what good is that? Why would I want a God that isn't large and in charge? That's the whole point for me, these people would say. I want a God that can fix it, which of course leads to the whole problem of evil, which is why so many who have lost faith and find the traditional God, omnipotent God, incredible, rediscover their faith through this distinction between creativity and God and the limitation of God's power. You could say the limitation of God's power, or you could say the identification of power with love, which is a different sort of power than coercive force. But I think there's a lot in this idea of creativity for Taoists, for example, to identify with as convergent with their own understanding of how reality works. And in Buddhism, obviously there's not as much of a tendency to personify the emptiness that out of which we all dependently co-arise, but at the same time there's Buddha nature and there's the Tathagata Garbha, if I didn't miss a syllable, which is this like suchness of the Buddha that's present in all things. And I've often thought that there's something like a intercultural loose correspondence between what in the Abrahamic traditions we would call the Imago Dei and what the Mahayana Buddhists would call Buddha nature. Like Buddha nature as the potentiality for enlightenment, and the Imago Dei as this potentiality for us to live up to the initial aim, in Whitehead sense. And so there are ways that we can make these connections. And I think for process thinkers, Whitehead's theology allows us to just be in a continual reflective mode of like questioning the personal side of the way that creativity can gain a personal character. And for me, I find that very important, but I also find it important to be able to not overly literalize that personality. And so I find, at least personally, tremendous resource. I gain a tremendous set of conceptual resources to think through my religious feelings. and my sense that, oh yeah, I don't want to overly personify this creativity, but at the same time, there's something in me that needs a personal relationship, you know? And so the Buddhist in me and the Christian in me are happy. And I don't know how much that translates to other people's experience of having multiple religious identities, but it seems to me to be a fruitful way of at least convening conversation without the need to convert, but with a shared curiosity about what we can learn from one another across these different cultural and religious, I don't want to say divides, but distinctions.
Yeah, I think one of the other real benefits of the process approach framework in terms of religion is it does give a way to understand and appreciate the historical shifts that have occurred within a religious tradition, the cross-pollination that occurred between different traditions, and to not only think historically about that, but into the future. So it is a way to see the continual development and change of one's own tradition and any others as a part of the continual unfolding of the authentic spiritual truths within each of these lineages, rather than being caught in this constant process of yearning for the original authentic form of the tradition, which is kind of at the heart of the more fundamentalist impulse that's struggling against modernity and so many other things
I think,
in unproductive
yeah,
ways usually.
I'd like to jump in just a second here. I think that the process tradition can lift up uh, many legitimate forms of spirituality. Uh, I wrote a little article once called Eight Forms of Mysticism um, Available. And one was a mysticism of the primordial nature, a sense of a realm of timeless potentials. One was a mysticism of the consequent nature, a sense of being embraced and loved in your own experience, just as you are. Um, One is a mysticism of the superjective nature. It's a prophetic, a sense of being called. One is a mysticism of creativity, um, a sense that there's a creative abyss of which all things are expressions, itself neither good nor evil, itself not with preferences. One was a mysticism of connectivity, a sense of the absolute interconnectedness of all things, sheer interrelationality. And one was a mysticism of the present moment, the primacy of the present moment. That was the Zen tradition. But I think if you put those on the table, then you can look at people coming from various traditions and say, do any of these speak to you? And maybe this is, maybe you have a special gift in a way. Maybe Buddhists are more aware of the mysticism of interconnectedness than are many others. So you can kind of claim your gift, but also see that others may constellate those in different ways that are also beautiful. So that the traditions become myriad forms of beauty, actually, distinct, not the same, unique. But the need is we need roots as well as wings. We need to build upon the past and not just be totally open to the future, hence the need for tradition. Jared, the only other thing I want to say here is I think that the process tradition can help us appreciate revelation-based traditions. And I'm thinking of Islam. in Judaism and Christianity that even speak of books that have sacred power. And those are they're originating texts, never fully exhausted, that contain lures for feeling, which can, in circumstance, help communities and individuals grow into wholeness. So I think the idea that a process religion is only about reason, but not about revelation, is a really, I hope not, because if so, good luck. You know, the revelation, Islam is going to be around a while. Orthodox Jews are going to be around a while.
So important.
Evangelical Christians are going to be around a while.
For better or worse, we're stuck with these traditions,
So
right?
let's find ways of naming the wisdom they contain rather than pretending that we have the wisdom and they don't.
Yeah, well said.
But they're fluid. Jared's point, they're fluid, they're dynamic. So to claim a tradition is not to claim something that's already defined completely. It's to become part of the defining process, I think.
Yeah, I like that redemption of revelation.
Yeah, yeah.
Because Whitehead says something interesting in Religion in the Making, that he obviously treats Islam unfairly in that text due to his ignorance of it, I think, but he's really focused on Buddhism and Christianity, and he says Christianity is a religion in search of a metaphysics, and Buddhism is a metaphysics in search of a religion. And I think another way of rendering that is to say Christianity and Islam, I would add, are born out of a kind of revelation.
Mm-hmm.
And what exactly that revelation means, and how it ought to shape our thought and action, it continues to be discussed and debated. But that core motivation and life-changing insight and impulse is the origin of it. And I think there's a sense in which the way that these things get worked out, Whitehead says somewhere that like the answer is clearer than the questions.
Mm-hmm.
Like we don't even know what the question is we're asking, and yet we feel so fervently these impulses to justice and love and truth, and
Mm-hmm.
that stem from that mysterious revelation. And it's like revelation inspires rationality.
Yes. And really Judaism too. I think I want to,
Sure. Yeah.
the
Yeah.
sign of the event, whatever it was.
Mm-hmm.
But I think it's Mordecai Kaplan that speaks of continuing revelation, and I mean he's not alone, but the continuous reconstruction of the tradition. I think that's a helpful phrase. Indebtedness, yes, but you're part of the construction.
Mm-hmm.
So reconstructive Judaism, but really reconstructive Islam,
Mm-hmm.
reconstructive Christianity.
Yeah. Yeah. And just to highlight and amplify something Jared was saying earlier, like all of these traditions are hybrids, and they have, like, East met West long time ago. Didn't just happen in California in the 60s. Like, Judaism and Islam and Christianity have a long history, and I think there's so much to draw upon in terms of peace movements in the present. Like, there's no reason that we need to be at war with each other. There were periods in the past when deep respect was shown between and among these traditions, and not just the three, traditions of Abraham, let's say, but there were Greek statues of Buddha, in the ancient world. So it's like, on some level, we don't need to invent this from scratch. Like there's plenty of examples of pluralism in the past that we can recover.
Yep. Yeah, I think in any of these traditions, you can find these kernels of
Mhm.
an impetus towards renewal, regeneration. In the Islamic context, the word is tajdeed for this kind of reconstruction, renewal,
Mhm.
and it shares the same trilateral root as ijtihad,
I see.
I believe, which is the legal term for sort of independent reasoning. So coming
Mhm.
to one's own sort of conclusion about some matter. Some interesting stuff. So
The closing off of Ijtihad. Uh, in historic, wasn't there a period in the history of Islam when some of the clerics said it's that no more need for Ijtihad? Is that correct?
yeah, there's always these discourses of finality. I mean, it's always a
Yeah,
push and pull for sure. I don't think they're going to be successful at closing that door, even if they wanted to be. And I mean, the whole idea of closing off the uh, sort of independent interpretation,
Mhm.
novel interpretation, is itself a novel independent
I see.
interpretation.
Mhm.
So again, kind of a performative contradiction there for sure. Yeah.
Hmm. Hmm. Yeah, I don't know if we have time in this session, but I'd love to speak more with you, Jared, about Islam and the way in which where you see the future of that spiritual tradition and what whether you see there being some kind of deep structure in the way that religions evolve over time, and if something like a um, equivalent of a Protestant Reformation or equivalent of a sort of Enlightenment. I mean, it was kind of a split in the West between church and state, and
Yeah.
the ways that these categories get reified. If that's like a necessary and inevitable thing that would need to happen internal to Islam and its own discovering Islamic civilization, discovering its own kind of modernity, or if you think there's a totally different trajectory that wouldn't imitate anything that's gone on in European societies, it'd be interesting to
Mhm.
talk through that at some point. That would take another 2 hours, but
Well, how
Yeah,
about
yeah.
give us a hint though, Jared, of where you would go with that?
Ooh, I mean, it's such big questions, and I mean, it's certainly politically and civilizationally very charged. I almost hesitate to give sound bites on that sort of topic. But
mm,
in certain respects, Islam, from its inception, is already much more Protestant
Mm,
in various ways in terms of there's not nearly so much mediation by some magisterium
mm,
in terms of one's religious, liturgical kind of central
mm,
practices. You just pray to God directly. You do your own ablution. These sorts of things. The question of Islam and state is a complicated one. I think there's a lot of very weak kind of reflection on this topic, both from folks who are, say, more secular, Western minded, and folks who are more, I don't want to say traditionalist, but people who have kind of internalized a more Western style literalism, which certainly exists
mm,
in Muslim context too. Uh, so it's
mm,
complicated. It's not that Islam is this is completely overriding ideology that is as much political as it is religious. There are political forms in traditional Islamic societies that are fully entangled with religious uh, aspects of the society, but at the same time, there's ways in which political powers and religious authorities were independent and interdependent in ways that offered checks and balances, not dissimilar to how more contemporary forms of governance try to divide powers and offer checks and balances. So yeah, I mean, happy to dive into these topics much more thoroughly in a future discussion. Might be a bit kind of Islam centric for conversations in process here, but
I'll
perhaps
have you on
not.
my
But
channel
yeah, sounds good.
because there's not enough Islam on my channel.
Jared, you wrote an essay, as I recall, in which you said that an Islamic process perspective
Mhm.
would endorse the notion of God as all powerful. Do I remember that correctly, Jared? In other words, I do wonder
Yeah.
what an Islamic process perspective might look like. And my intuition is it would not be easily happy with the finitude of God.
Right.
It,
Yeah. So
it would lean more toward a Neoplatonic.
yeah.
But I really want to ask you, I don't want to proclaim that.
Mhm.
Can you end with just a thought on that? I'd really appreciate that.
Yeah, sure. I don't want to speak with like total finality or authority here. I mean, this is still a very under-researched topic in terms of what Islamic process theologies could look like, and what viable forms would be. I mean, you could propose a form of Islamic process theology that is contains this kind of strong rejection of divine omnipotence that is
Mhm.
common in some of the Christian forms of process theism. I think most of the ways those are formulated are going to be very. I don't think there's going to be much uptake. I don't think there's all that much interest in that vision in amongst Muslims, and there's certainly a lot that in the existing tradition that is in conflict with that. So, whereas I find some Thomas Ord and John Cobb's kind of biblical arguments against omnipotence in a Christian context to be quite compelling, there's a lot more in the Quranic revelation that is pretty darn clear. I mean, this is in the original Arabic too. That's like, okay, yeah, God is in some sense all powerful or the sole agent even. But I mean, there's been complex discussions across Islamic history about what that means, how divine power interacts with creaturely agency and such. So yeah, I'd be tend to think that a kind of process Neoplatonic synthesis
Mhm.
would be a lot more interesting to Muslims than something that is a little more wholesale against uh, the idea of omnipotence. I mean, we're using Western terms here. I mean, it'd be best to be using the actual Arabic Islamic terms in these discussions and look at some of the etymological connections and things like that, draw on these scriptural verses that do exist. One thing I find distinct in Islamic spirituality, especially compared to Christianity, is there is a foregrounded aspect of the what I'd call the really what the tradition would call the majesty of God, but you can
Mhm.
see this as kind of the negative element. I mean, you have divine names like Al-Mumit, the giver of death,
Mhm.
and so that's that's right on the label, so to speak.
Mhm.
And so this idea, this whole kind of theodicy is given a different aesthetics than it is in Christianity, where the the kind of positive aspects of God, love and mercy, are much more singularly emphasized. Not that these are at all underemphasized in Islam. This whole idea of divine compassion, uh, Al-Rahman, Al-Rahim, those are the kind of divine names for that idea, are ubiquitous. Truly, some of the, I mean, every verse, every chapter rather of the Quran begins with these. So it's hard to say that that isn't like primarily foregrounded, but nonetheless, these negative elements are really insisted upon, these majestic aspects of divinity. So I think it gives you there's a different phenomenology
Mhm,
to the
mhm,
encounter with theodicy in a way that shifts this discussion. And this is something I really want to dig into and do some real research and writing on, but haven't gotten around to it yet. I
Mm.
mean, yeah, when if we move out of the Abrahamic context and go to Taoism or something, certainly everything is the Tao in a certain sense
mhm,
from that perspective. But nonetheless, this whole theodicy question isn't raised in the same way. A Taoist isn't necessarily lamenting and going on big
mhm,
intellectual ventures to figure out why the Tao has caused this
mhm,
tragedy in their life. And so I think the
mhm,
kind of basic ingredients of Islamic theology and spirituality give a somewhat different starting point in a similar way,
mhm,
where theodicy isn't raised and felt in exactly the same way as it is in the Christian context. So,
Mm. Mm. It makes me wonder what Carl Jung would say about Islam and the Quran potentially being more psychologically integrated in the sense that
mhm,
light and shadow are acknowledged in the Godhead instead of,
right.
he
Yeah.
thinks, in Christianity, the overemphasis on love and light,
mhm,
which
Mm-hmm.
calls forth its compensatory opposite. Um, and that yeah, maybe Islam has in a psychological sense dealt better with the shadow of God.
Mm-hmm.
So
Yeah, I mean,
less
it's
in,
still hard stuff to square for sure. I mean, even though the scripture says, "Oh yeah, this is also the giver of death," and blah blah blah. I mean, actually, existentially encountering those aspects of divinity is still. I mean, that's a deeply spiritual experience and a in a
Mhm.
intense way of its own that requires some
Yeah,
real grappling. So,
yeah, yeah. And just like in the etymological sense of power, um, Whitehead's always pointing to Plato's dialogue with Sophist, where Plato has Socrates say, like, being is power, but power is not just the capacity to affect, but to be affected by.
mhm,
yeah, yeah.
I mean, the Greek dynamis is like
mhm,
potentiality. It's got this more passive actually meaning to it.
Mhm,
And so I think Taoism, the Tao could be described as omnipotent in that sense of the ultimate
mhm,
passivity, that which can receive all.
mhm,
mhm,
um, and so I think there's a way in which just really dwelling upon the deeper meaning of this term, we see its ambiguity really just built in there.
mhm,
Um,
yeah,
so
yeah.
we can, we can play with scripture and offer different interpretations of what it means.
Mhm. Yeah, this is something that came out in one of our previous episodes with scholar of Sufism, Ali Hussein, who mentioned that the Islamic term that encapsulates monotheism, tawheed, is a certain form of the word that it's not just a static noun, it actually means like making one rather than
mhm,
just oneness.
Oh, interesting.
And so, yeah, there's something to play around with there for sure. And yeah, all these divine names, God is the living, I think Al Hayy, yeah, there's something going on there. Something's alive. It's not just sitting there in occultation. And yeah, so much in Sufi spirituality goes back to this hadith about God being this hidden treasure longing to be known. And so that was kind of the impetus for
Mhm.
creation in the first place. So it's uh, immediately something that has these kind of emotive tones to it that the lover and the beloved, I don't know if that's a relationship of stasis. So
of what?
stasis, yeah,
Oh,
that's
yeah, yeah.
I would say no.
Mm.
Well, listen, we need to have another conversation in process, Jared, in which you're the one that we talked to about Islamic process thought, and Matt and I will be the dialogue partners.
All righty. I just heard back Tom Ord's new project with people responding to his book on amipotence. So I got an essay that's going to be coming out in that text that it's kind of critiquing some of his formulations, but in a very collegial sort of way from a Islamic process
Good.
perspective. So that can give some of the contours
Yeah,
of
good.
this dialogue a little more form.
Cool. Look forward to that.
Well,
Well,
thanks.
Right.
I
Thank
should probably
you.
eat some lunch, but this has
Likewise.
been nourishing, actually,
Mhm.
to really
Yeah.
explore these important topics with both of you. Appreciate the insights you both shared.
Mhm.
Thank you, Matt. Thanks, Jared.
Yeah, good to see you both. Take care.
Okay.
All right. Till
Good
next
luck
time.
in editing all this, Jared.
Ooh, we're hiring. We just completed all our interviews, and I think we have chosen a person to fill the position as my helper. So it
All
might
right.
not even have to
Good.
be me. So
Good.
Nice.
uh-huh.
Glad you have help
Yeah.
Yes, me
in
too.
doing so much. Yeah.
Uh,
Take
Awesome.
care.
All right.
peace. Bye.
Take care, guys.